In this video, we're going to demystify lactate and answer 3 crucial questions. What is lactate? What role does it play inside the body? And most importantly, why does lactate rise during exercise? In the last few years, I've been fortunate to work with hundreds of athletes in different sports such as CrossFit, MMA, cycling, running, and even sailing, providing them guidance, education, and coaching around lactate testing, the role of lactate in exercise, and endurance training in general. I've also had the chance to interview some of the best endurance coaches in the world, and it's all those experiences and findings that I'll be sharing with you today. So whether you're an athlete trying to improve your performance or a coach trying to better understand what happens inside the body during exercise, in this presentation, I'm going to share with you everything that I've learned so far about lactate, how important this molecule actually is, and the reason why we see elevated levels of lactate during exercise. Throughout this presentation, I'll also bust a few myths around lactate, so make sure you watch this video all the way to the end. If you enjoy this type of structured and educational content, be sure to subscribe to the channel and leave me a comment below letting me know what topic you would like to see me cover next. By the way, if you're new to the channel, my name is Sean and welcome to Upside Strength. All right, guys, let's dive right into it. Why does lactate rise during exercise? Let's first look at the roadmap that we'll be following throughout this presentation. We'll look at what is lactate, the roles of lactate inside the body, and finally, why does lactate rise during exercise? Why do we see elevated levels of lactate during exercise? And I'll also bust 3 common myths about lactate along the way, so make sure you stay tuned all the way to the end. So what is lactate? Lactate was discovered in 1780, actually from sour milk. It was then in 1808 established by Jacob Berzelius. I'm sorry about the name pronunciation. He said that lactate occurred in exercising muscles, so already in the early 1800s. And finally, about 70 years later, the structure of lactate was established by a gentleman called Johannes Wislicenus. So in 1873, he determined the structure of lactate itself. So what is actually lactate? What is the structure of lactate? So if we look at it more closely, it's essentially a half sugar if you want to keep it simple. 3 carbon molecules or 3 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 3 oxygen atoms all bound together. It is produced in the muscle. We will usually measure it inside the blood, which is abbreviated BLA, blood lactate, and it is measured in millimoles per liter. This is the value that you usually see. It's possible to measure it in other ways, but in the context of exercise, this is the easiest, even though it isn't very, very easy. It remains the easiest place to measure it. If we talk about normal or common lactate levels at rest, we'll usually see anywhere from 0.5 to 2.5 millimoles of lactate. And when we're exercising, when somebody's exercising really high or really hard, we might see up to above 20 millimoles of lactate. We'll usually see this in very high level and very powerful athletes. So if you think about track cyclists or rowers, you definitely won't see above 20 millimoles in that many people, but it is possible to see those kind of levels. So where does lactate production occur? Very simply, you have a glucose molecules that enters the cell, whether it's by insulin or not. And then, again, keeping things very simple here, we're going to have the process of glycolysis that is going to take place. And through glycolysis, we have the breakdown of sugar into lactate and pyruvate. All this happens inside the cytosol of the cell. And we're mainly going to have lactate. We're going to have a little bit of pyruvate as well. We'll go back on that distinction later on. And it's actually a common myth that lactate only is produced in an anaerobic environment. So when lack of oxygen is being manifested, it's actually not true. Lactate occurs at rest. It occurs in fully aerobic conditions, as they say. And this is something that's been verified now for many years through the research. So lactate is produced inside the cytosol of the cell independently of oxygen levels. That's an important myth that we need to go through at first. And if we actually think about pyruvate and lactate, so usually what was said is that when there's enough oxygen around, the byproduct of glycolysis is pyruvate, and when there isn't enough oxygen, then it is lactate. It turns out that it might not be that way. It seems like at rest, we might have a 10-to-1 lactate to pyruvate ratio. And in exercising muscles, and that's in the muscles, not inside the blood, and inside the exercising muscle, it might go up to 300 or 400 to 1 lactate to pyruvate. So it seems to be because of the way the balance of the equation of lactate dehydrogenase happens. Essentially, it's very much in favor of lactate. At least that's what I've been able to find in the recent research. So where does the lactate go after it is produced inside the cytosol of the cell? There's a few important concepts to understand today, and one of them is what we're going to call the lactate shuttle. So lactate essentially moves from areas of high concentration to low concentration. So it just follows a concentration gradient. And it's also going to be influenced by hydrogen ion concentration, essentially the acidity of the environment that it's in. But what you need to remember is that you have driver and recipient cells. So those that produce lactate and then those that consume it. The lactate can be produced and used inside the same cell. It can be produced and then oxidized in an adjacent fiber, muscle fiber. It can be produced and then put into circulation. So it can be oxidized elsewhere. It goes to other places as well. We'll see that in a second. But essentially, the mitochondrial reticulum, the network of mitochondria within your cells, plays an important role in lactate and pyruvate transport and oxidation, obviously, inside the cell. And you also have transporters that are called MCTs that are going to essentially transport pyruvate and lactate from different locations. Those are all important concepts to understand here. The lactate shuttle concept, which again is a bit of an umbrella term for many different phenomena inside the body. So the most important role of lactate inside the body is as a fuel, or at least it's one of the three main roles of lactate inside the body is lactate as a fuel. So at rest, you have slow twitch fibers, that are net producers of lactate. And as such, you have some lactate even inside the blood at even in a resting condition. You could measure your blood lactate right now and it would not be 0.0, even though you're not exercising and even though there's lots of oxygen around, like we said before. But what's interesting is even those slow twitch fibers, they can switch roles when they need to. So they can go from producing cells to consumer cells if they need to. But usually what you'll see is that during exercise, the white fibers, so the fast twitch fibers, as we call them, they have, let's call them a high glycolytic tendency or a high glycolytic profile or predisposition, given the concentration of glycolytic enzymes and glycogen stores within those fibers. That's just kind of what they're made to do. They're going to produce lactate in fairly high amounts, especially at very high intensities. And that lactate is then going to be reused by the red fibers, by the slow twitch fibers inside the same tissue bed. So this is an important thing to understand. The different cells can have different roles at different points in time. So lactate is an important fuel inside the body. It's essentially a way to see it is that lactate is going to be the link between glycolysis and oxidative metabolism. And that was illustrated really well in George Brooks' recent paper from 2021. I'll link that at the end of the presentation, of course, so you can go do a bit of digging around if you wish to do so. But lactate is really the fulcrum of metabolism, as Brooks coined it with his colleagues. It's a very important molecule in that regard. It's also a very important signaling molecule. It's going to have different things that it's going to interact with, one of them being the downregulation of lipolysis. So lactate is going to downregulate the breakdown of fat stores into available free fatty acids in circulation. So essentially, the higher your lactate levels, the less free fatty acid you'll find in circulation, and also the less free fatty acid are going to be able to enter the mitochondria and then get oxidized. So essentially what happens is that lactate binds to a receptor that downregulates the release of free fatty acids from adipose tissue into the blood, and it also blocks the transfer of that free fatty acid into the mitochondria. So essentially, if we were to look at it on a graph, and I've adapted another graph here from Inigo Samalan's paper from 2018, what you see is that as lactate rises, we're going to see fat oxidation levels decrease. And that's not the only thing that lactate is going to influence from a signaling perspective. It's also going to affect cell redox state. It's going to affect reactive oxygen species production. It's going to have some impact on signaling between organs, the liver and the adipose tissue. It's going to have an impact on gene expression, on inflammation, and more. So as you can see here, it has many, many roles inside the body. It's not just the byproduct of glycolysis. It's really an important molecule inside the body. The third big role that it plays is as the primary gluconeogenetic precursor. What that means is, so first let's define gluconeogenesis. So gluco for glucose, sugar, neo as new, genesis as the generation or the making of. And so what happens is that one of the things that happens inside the body when you have some extra lactate kicking around is that this lactate is going to be transported to the liver, and then inside the liver via the Cori cycle, you're going to have essentially a reversal of glycolysis. So it's not the same enzymatic steps, it's not the same processes, not the same chemical reactions that occur, but essentially in glycolysis, we take glucose and we break it down into lactate and pyruvate, and then gluconeogenesis happens via the Cori cycle inside the liver, and it's the opposite. So you go from lactate to pyruvate to glucose, and that glucose can then be shuttled back to the cells and then stored back into glycogen. So it's essentially closing that cycle, and this is going to help with maintaining glycogen stores. It's going to help to maintain blood sugar levels as well. There's also some interesting advances in research regarding potential for lactate treatment of illness and injury. This is quite a young field still, but there's many things to look into here. So as you can see, lactate is really a very important player inside the human body, and should definitely not be put aside as just a byproduct of metabolism. Another important myth that we need to go through here is that contrary to popular belief, lactate is not the cause of fatigue or pain. So usually during exercise, it's mainly going to be inorganic phosphates, hydrogen ions, ADP accumulation, reactive oxygen species accumulation. Those things are going to be the main culprits for fatigue and for pain during exercise. And then if we talk about DOMS, so delayed onset muscle soreness, how you feel a day, 2 days, 3 days after a hard training session. For a long time, people thought it might be lactate that was still there, but lactate's going to clear from the body pretty quickly within, if not minutes, maybe 30, 40, 50 minutes. If you're not doing anything, that excess lactate's going to clear, and you're going to be back to baseline pretty quickly. So the next day, there's definitely not any excess lactate to hurt you, so to speak. When it comes to the DOMS, it's more going to be about muscle damage, nervous system signaling, and inflammation. At least that's what it seems like currently, but lactate is definitely not the culprit for either your pain or your fatigue during exercise. Now let's tackle that third big question: why does lactate rise during exercise? And for that, what I'm going to use is a very simple analogy, and that is of a dam. And essentially, the dam is going to hold water for as long as it can until there's just too much water accumulating. And now that water is going to run over and it's going to start spilling over into the next basin. If you can understand this, you can understand exactly why lactate rises during exercise. So let's go to a slightly more involved diagram here. So at the muscle level on the left here, essentially we can deal with excess lactate production as long as our mitochondria can buffer that byproduct. So as long as the mitochondria can absorb essentially all the lactate, the excess lactate that's produced, we're going to have blood lactate that's going to stay around resting levels. Once we exceed that capacity at the muscular or at the cellular level, we're going to start to see elevated lactate inside the blood, although it is going to remain stable at the whole body level. And it's not until we kind of exceed that whole body capacity to tolerate those higher levels of lactate that we're going to start seeing very quickly rising levels of lactate within the blood. So think of it in 3 stages. You have the essentially you have the cellular or the muscular equilibrium or balance that happens at the low intensity end of the spectrum. And then in what we call the heavy intensity domain, what you're going to see is a systemic balance or a systemic equilibrium. So elevated blood lactate, but it is going to remain stable. And then once we pass beyond what people call either threshold, MLSS, critical speed, power, anaerobic threshold, many terms for it. Once you pass that transition from essentially steady to the red zone, now you lose that steady state. There is no more internal balance, and you're going to see again quickly rising levels of lactate, and you're going to tend towards VO2 max and failure shortly after. If we were to represent that slightly differently on the graph, again, we have blood lactate that is around resting levels here in the moderate domain, elevated but stable in the heavy domain, and then let's call it an exponential rise in lactate in the severe intensity domain. So this is how it kind of happens and why it happens. And this is also why it's important to make sure that we have individual assessments and profiling when you work with different athletes, different populations, because not everybody is going to have those same transition points on the intensity spectrum. And I'm going to go back to another great graph adapted once more from Inigo's paper from 2018. And here we see power on the x-axis and blood lactate in millimoles per liter on the y-axis. And again, what we see is very different trends depending on who you're looking at. Somebody suffering from metabolic syndrome, their lactate curve might look like this. So there's not even any steady state at the bottom. It just starts rising right away. And if we look at the opposite end of the spectrum, we're going to see the pro cyclist here with a very, very different lactate profile. It stays nice and flat until about 220 watts. So again, the pro cyclist, if we take just this curve to represent the avatar of the pro cyclist, can maintain muscular or cellular steady state all the way up until about 220 watts. And those guys usually weigh in the 60 to 70 kilo range. So it's highly impressive, obviously. And you can see somebody suffering from metabolic syndrome that barely exhibits a steady state, if at all. And then in between, you do have the moderately active individual. So again, individual assessment of that profile is something important to make sure the training is appropriate for you, but also to track progress over time. Another lactate myth that we can go through here is that of lactate versus lactic acid. And what you can read in that paper from Robargs and all in 2017 is essentially that there is no such entity as lactic acid in any living cell or physiological system. Indeed, it is impossible based on the fundamental laws of physics that underpin the disciplines of organic chemistry, metabolic biochemistry, acid-base chemistry, and physiology for lactic acid to be produced or present in living systems where cellular and tissue pH is regulated to be between 6.0 and 7.45. So go read the little paper that I put in the additional information if you want to know more about this. I have heard from some people that you still see a very small proportion of lactic acid inside the body, but it's the overall majority is lactate. I mean, if that's even important, I'm not sure, but remember that when we're talking, if we want to use the right terminology, we want to talk about lactate as being the byproduct of glycolysis and not lactic acid. So here you have it. Let's go through a couple takeaways for this video. So the first one being that lactate is the end product of glycolysis, okay? It is the result of the breakdown of either glycogen or glucose, essentially sugars. We break this down and we get lactate. Lactate is an important fuel, an important signaling molecule, and the main gluconeogenic precursor. And so those are its main roles inside the body, and they're very important, and we wouldn't do very well without it. And finally, if we talk about blood lactate rising, blood lactate rises during exercise when the rate of production outpaces the rate of oxidation. So essentially, as soon as you start producing more than you can reutilize at any given moment in time, we're going to see elevated levels of lactate. And remember that sequence, those 3 steps, so to speak. We have the muscular or the cellular level, then we have the systemic or the whole body level, and then we have that loss of balance, totally going towards failure. If you want to dig a little bit deeper into the content of this video, here are your deep dive resources. Feel free to go and read those papers and the references in said papers. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you leave me a comment below to let me know what topic you'd like me to cover next. And on that note, I will see you in the next one. Take care.